Caleb Mercer looked at her once. Just once. The way a man looks at a piece of furniture he ordered and decides doesn't match the room. Then he turned his back on Eliza Hartwell in front of the entire town of Red Valley, Arizona, and walked away without a single word. No explanation, no apology, not even the decency of a lie. She was standing on the train platform with one suitcase, a letter he had written her with his own hand, and $41 to her name. She had traveled 1,900 miles on the strength of his promise, and he dismissed her in under 10 seconds. The women on the platform whispered. The men looked away. A child nearby asked her mother why that lady looked like she was going to be sick, and her mother hushed her and pulled her in the opposite direction. If you have ever been made to feel invisible in front of a crowd, you already know what Eliza felt in that moment. And if you haven't, ask yourself right now, what would you have done? If this story moves you, hit the like button and drop the name of your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, subscribe and follow along, because this one is far from over. Matzat. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in early March, when the ground in Millbrook, Ohio was still frozen solid, and Eliza had spent the morning breaking ice off the water trough with the back of an axe because the hired man hadn't shown up again. She was 31 years old. She had been managing her father's farm since she was 19, first alongside him, then alone after the stroke that took most of his movement and all of his speech, and then entirely alone after he died 2 winters ago and left her the land, the debt, and nothing else she could sell fast enough to matter. She had placed the advertisement herself. She wasn't ashamed of it. Women in her situation placed advertisements. It was practical. It was honest. She had written it the way she wrote everything, plainly, without decoration. Widow of farm work, age 31, no children, capable in all domestic and field matters, seeks honest man with land and intention of building, not looking for romance, looking for a partner. Caleb Mercer had responded within 3 weeks. His letter was 2 full pages, written in a clear, slanted hand that suggested someone who had been schooled carefully. He owned 400 acres in the Red Valley territory of Arizona. He ran cattle. He had no family nearby and was tired of running the operation without someone steady beside him. He said she sounded like exactly what the ranch needed. He used the word capable 3 times, which she liked. Men who said beautiful in the first letter were men looking for something she couldn't give. They wrote back and forth for 6 weeks. He asked about her experience with cattle, which she had some of. He asked about her health, which was solid. He sent her money for the train ticket and told her which platform to arrive on and said he would be there himself. No intermediary, no confusion. She sold what remained of her father's farm to a neighbor who had been circling it for years, paid off the last of the banknote, and had enough left over to fill 1 suitcase and arrive in Arizona with $41 she intended to stretch until the ranch showed a profit. She did not sleep well on the train, not because she was afraid exactly, but because something in her chest kept tightening in a way she couldn't name. She told herself it was nerves. She had made decisions like this before, practical decisions that felt like falling, that turned out to be fine. She pressed her forehead against the window and watched the landscape change from flat frozen farmland to red rock and dry brush. And she thought, this is either the smartest thing you've ever done or the worst, and you won't know which for a while. She arrived in Red Valley on a Thursday afternoon in April, when the sun was high and the heat was the kind she hadn't prepared herself for. The kind that comes up from the ground, as well as down from the sky, so you feel surrounded by it. Caleb Mercer was standing near the front of the small crowd gathered at the platform. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, dark hat, the kind of face that had spent years outdoors and looked permanently weathered because of it. He was watching the train. He hadn't seen her yet. She walked toward him and said his name. He turned, and she watched his face do something she had not expected and could not quite describe. So it didn't fall exactly. It didn't go through the theatrical stages of disappointment she might have anticipated. It simply closed, like a door someone pulls shut quietly because they don't want to make a scene. His eyes moved across her once, taking inventory, and whatever he was counting didn't add up to what he had expected. "Mr. Mercer," she said again, because the silence had stretched past the point of comfortable. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was polite. That was what made it worse. I appreciate you making the trip. The phrasing landed wrong before she could fully understand why. I appreciate you making the trip, past tense, gratitude for something concluded. I'm glad to finally, she started. I don't think this is going to work out, he said. She stopped. Around them, the platform noise continued. Luggage being lifted, people greeting each other, a dog barking somewhere near the depot office. The world had not paused for this. I beg your pardon, she said. He wasn't cruel about it. That almost made it harder. He had the look of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with and had resolved to get through the discomfort as quickly as possible. I should have written before you left, he said. That's on me. But I think we're both better off if we're direct. You invited me here, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I did, and I misjudged what I was looking for. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded envelope. There's enough in there to get you back to Ohio, or wherever you want to go. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. He held out the envelope. She looked at it. She did not take it. He set it on top of her suitcase, nodded once, and walked away. She stood on the platform for a long time after he disappeared, long enough that the crowd thinned out, and the depot agent had started sweeping, and a woman with 2 small children gave her a look of open pity that felt like a second humiliation layered on top of the first. Eliza picked up the envelope. Inside was $25. $25 to cover 1,900 miles of travel and the dismantling of an entire life. She counted it twice, standing in the heat. Then she folded it back up and put it in her coat pocket and picked up her suitcase. She did not cry. She had made a rule about that a long time ago, not because she thought crying was weak, but because she had learned that there were moments in life when your body wanted to fall apart and you simply couldn't afford to let it, and this was one of them. She could fall apart later, when there was somewhere private to do it. Right now she needed to think. She had $66 total, a suitcase, no return ticket, and a town full of strangers who had just watched a man she'd never met decide she wasn't worth the trouble. She walked off the platform and into the main street of Red Valley. It wasn't a large town, a bank, a dry goods store, a livery, a hotel with a sagging porch, a saloon already doing business despite the hour. She walked into the hotel and asked the rate, $4 a week for the smallest room, which meant she could stay 16 weeks before she was out of money entirely if she ate nothing. She took the room and carried her suitcase upstairs and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the floor. The floor needed sweeping. The window latch was broken. There was a crack in the ceiling plaster shaped vaguely like a river. She thought about Ohio, about the farm she had sold, the house she had left, the neighbor who had already moved his fences over. There was nothing to go back to. She had made sure of that before she left, the way she always made sure of things, thoroughly, with no exits left unsealed, because she had learned that keeping an escape route was the same as never fully committing to where you were going. She had committed. She just hadn't anticipated that the destination would change on arrival. What she needed was work. She went downstairs and asked the hotel clerk if there was anywhere in town hiring. He looked at her the way people look at a thing that has arrived in the wrong place and doesn't quite understand it yet, somewhere between confused and sorry. He mentioned the diner might need a hand washing dishes. He mentioned the laundry on the eastern end of town sometimes hired women. He did not mention anything that would pay her enough to matter. She thanked him and went to the diner first. The woman who ran it was named Mabel Couch, and she had the eyes of someone who had survived a number of things and didn't much care what you had survived as long as you could move fast and didn't complain. She hired Eliza for meals and $2 a week, which was worse than Eliza had hoped, but better than nothing, and Eliza accepted before she finished the sentence. She worked the dinner rush that evening, moving plates and washing up and keeping her head down, while 3 separate tables discussed the woman who'd come in on the afternoon train and got herself rejected in public. She heard her own name twice. She didn't react. She finished her shift, ate what was left in the kitchen, and walked back to the hotel through the warm night air. It was sitting on the front step of the hotel, trying to think through what came next, when a man named Roy Prentice stopped to light his pipe and mentioned, not to her directly, more to the air in front of him, that old Caldwell's place out on the South Road had gone quiet. Hadn't seen Ethan Caldwell in town in some weeks. Ranch looked rough from the road. People were starting to wonder if something had happened to him. He said this the way people say things that are meant to be heard, half-pronouncements dropped in public for anyone who finds them useful. Eliza filed the information away. She asked, carefully, who Ethan Caldwell was. Roy Prentice looked at her sidelong and said, "Man who used to run the best cattle operation in this part of the territory. Before." He paused. "Before everything." She asked what everything meant. He tapped his pipe against his boot. "Wife died. Drought took 2 seasons. Lost most of his herd to sickness. He kind of, stopped. You know how some men just stop?" He looked at her like he expected her to understand, and she did understand because she had watched her father stop after her mother left, and it had been like watching a clock run down. "Ranch is still there. Caldwell's still there, far as anyone knows. But nobody goes out that way much anymore." He wandered off. Eliza sat on the step for another hour. In the morning, she asked Mabel about it, and Mabel confirmed. Ethan Caldwell, 53, owned the largest single piece of land in the Southern Valley, had a creek running through it, which was the real value. Victor Hale had been trying to buy it for 2 years, and Caldwell kept refusing, which most people thought was stubbornness, and Mabel privately thought was the one sensible thing left the man did. "Why does Hale want it so badly?" Eliza asked, refilling the coffee urn. Mabel looked at her. "Because water's the only thing that matters out here. Everything else can be rebuilt. Water can't." Eliza thought about this for most of the morning. After the lunch rush, she told Mabel she needed the afternoon and set out on the South Road on foot, carrying half a sandwich she hadn't finished, and the practical awareness that this was probably a mistake, and she was going anyway. The Caldwell Ranch was 3 miles from town. The road to it was rutted and dry, and the afternoon heat pressed down on her shoulders in a way that felt personal. She could see the shape of the place from a quarter-mile out, the main house, 2 barns, a series of fence lines, some of which were still standing. From a distance, it looked like a property in mid-exhale, not quite collapsed but not holding itself up either. She pushed open the gate, which gave a scream of rust that announced her arrival to anyone within earshot, and walked up to the front door and knocked. Silence. She knocked again, harder. "Go away." The voice came from inside, and it was the voice of a man who had not been talking to anyone for some time, rough, low, scraped dry. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "my name is Eliza Hartwell. I've just arrived in Red Valley, and I'm looking for work. I'm told your ranch might need hands." Silence again. Then, "Who told you that?" "A man named Prentice mentioned it." "Prentice talks too damn much." A pause. "I don't need hands." "With respect," Eliza said, "I could see your south fence from the road. You need something." A long pause. Long enough that she thought the conversation was finished and began mentally calculating the walk back to town. The door opened. Ethan Caldwell was not what she expected, which meant he was exactly what she expected, which was a man in serious trouble who was doing a poor job of hiding it. He was taller than she'd pictured from Roy Prentice's description, thinner than he should have been, and there was something wrong with his right arm. He was holding it close to his body in the way of someone who has learned not to move a thing that hurts. His shirt was not clean. His eyes were clear, which surprised her, but they were also the eyes of someone who had been alone too long and didn't entirely trust that what they were seeing was real. He looked at her. "You're the woman from the train station," he said. She kept her expression even. "I am." He seemed to think about several things at once. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Whatever you need," she said. "I grew up on a working farm. I can manage livestock, basic medical care for animals and people, fence repair, garden, preserve, cook. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for wages and a place to sleep that isn't costing me money I don't have." He looked past her at the yard, then back at her. "I can't afford wages right now." "Then we negotiate something else," she said. "But I'd need to know what's wrong with your arm first." He blinked. She thought for a moment he was going to tell her to leave. Instead, he stepped back from the door and let her in. The inside of the house was dim and close and smelled of wood smoke and something medicinal underneath, and the general staleness of a place where a person has been staying mostly in one spot for too long. He led her to the kitchen table, which was covered in papers and 2 empty coffee cups and a lantern that had burned itself out. He sat down in the chair nearest the wall, and she saw him wince when he moved his arm. "Let me see it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he rolled up his sleeve. The wound had started as something minor, a cut maybe, from a tool or a fence wire. She could see where it had been that. What it was now was an infection that had been running for at least 2 weeks, the skin around it red and tight and hot when she pressed the back of her hand close without touching. He needed a doctor. The problem was she could see from every detail of the room and the yard and the man himself that there was no money for a doctor, or if there was, he had convinced himself there wasn't, which came to the same thing. "This has been going on too long," she said. "I know." "Why didn't you go to town?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it wasn't really an answer. "I don't go to town much." She looked at him. He looked at the table. She understood, in the particular way you understand things that aren't said directly, that going to town meant explaining himself, and he had run out of whatever allowed him to do that. "Do you have clean cloth?" she asked. "And something to boil water in?" He told her where things were. She went and found them. She worked on the wound for most of an hour, and he made sounds a few times that she pretended not to hear because they were the sounds of someone trying very hard not to make sounds. And she kept her hands steady and her focus on what she was doing and did not comment on any of it. When she was done, she wrapped it correctly and told him what signs to watch for and what to do if it got worse. He said, "You've done this before." "A few times," she said. "Farms aren't gentle." He looked at his wrapped arm. Then he looked at the papers on the table. Then he looked at her. "The east pasture fence needs 2 sections replaced," he said. "The well rope's fraying. The horses haven't been properly fed in." He stopped. She watched him calculate how much honesty was survivable. 4 days. She stood up. "Show me where the feed is," she said. He started to rise and she put up a hand. "Tell me. Don't get up yet. Give it an hour." He told her. She went out and fed the horses. There were 3 of them, a roan gelding and 2 bays, and they were thin in a way that made something in her chest ache because animals don't understand the reasons why the care stops. They just experience the stopping. She gave them extra and checked their hooves and found the gelding had a stone bruise he'd been walking on. She worked it out with a tool from the tack room, moving slowly, talking to him the way her father had taught her to talk to horses. Not sweetly, not performatively, just steadily. The way you'd talk to someone you were trying to convince that the situation was manageable. When she went back inside, Ethan Caldwell was still at the table. He had fallen asleep in the chair. She looked at him for a moment. He looked asleep, like someone who had been fighting something for a long time, and the fighting was exhausting him past what he could keep covering up. She found a blanket in the back room and put it over his shoulders, which woke him part way. He looked at her with unfocused eyes. "The horses are fed," she said. "I'll look at the fence in the morning if that's agreeable." He said something that wasn't quite words. She found a spot on the floor of the back room with her coat folded under her head and a second blanket she'd spotted on a shelf, and she lay there in the dark and listened to the particular silence of land that has gone too quiet. And she thought about Ohio and about the fact that she was sleeping on a stranger's floor in Arizona with $66 and no clear plan. And she thought, well, this is where you are. Start from here. She had no idea, lying there in the dark, that a man named Victor Hale already knew she was in Red Valley, that he had been watching the Caldwell property for months, waiting for the moment it would break, that her arrival had been noted, assessed, and filed away as either an opportunity or an obstacle, depending on how the next few weeks played out. She had no idea that the infection in Ethan Caldwell's arm was the least dangerous thing threatening the ranch. She had no idea that the fight she had just walked into was going to be nothing like the one she had prepared herself for. But she was there. She had made that decision, the small, irreversible kind, the kind that doesn't feel enormous in the moment but turns out to be the hinge everything else swings on. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. Outside, the desert went on in every direction, indifferent and vast, and the stars over Red Valley were the kind you only see when there are no other lights for miles, the kind that look like they're too many, like someone overdid it. And in a small cabin on the South Road, a woman who had been left behind by the life she planned lay down in the wreckage of someone else's and began, quietly and without ceremony, to build something new. She was up before the sun. That wasn't unusual for her. She had spent most of her adult life waking in the dark to get a head start on days that required more hours than they contained. But the first morning at the Caldwell Ranch was different from farm mornings in Ohio, because everything was unfamiliar, every sound and smell, and the particular quality of the dark itself. And she lay on the floor of the back room for about 30 seconds, listening to the silence before her body accepted that it was morning and there was work to do. Ethan was still asleep in the chair when she came through the kitchen. He had slid sideways in the night, his head listing toward his left shoulder, the blanket she'd put over him gathered in his lap. She did not wake him. She had looked at enough unwell people in her life to know that sleep was doing work medicine couldn't, and his body needed to run that work as long as it could. She went outside into the gray pre-dawn and stood in the yard and looked at what daylight was beginning to reveal. It was worse than she'd estimated from the road. Not catastrophically. The structure of the place was still sound, the bones of it hadn't gone, but it had the specific look of a property that had been maintained by one person who had slowly run out of capacity and had been letting the least urgent things go for so long that the list of least urgent things had grown until it was indistinguishable from the list of urgent things. Fence posts leaning in the east pasture. The water trough near the smaller barn had a crack in it she'd missed last night. Slow leak, the ground beneath it perpetually damp. The chicken coop door hung wrong. One hinge pulled half out of the wood, which explained why there were no chickens visible, which meant they'd gotten out or been gotten to, and she wasn't sure which yet. She started with the horses because she always started with the animals. You could let a broken fence post lean for another day. You couldn't do that with a living thing that depended on you. The roan gelding remembered her from the night before. He came to the stall door when he heard her moving in the tack room and stood watching her with a kind of tired patience that she found oddly comforting. She checked his bruised hoof in the early light, still tender but not worse, and made a mental note to keep him off hard ground for a few days if that was manageable. The two bays were calmer this morning than they'd been last night, which meant the feeding had mattered, which meant they hadn't had enough. She found grain, not much of it, maybe a week's supply if she rationed carefully. She fed them, refilled the water, and was in the process of mucking out the nearest stall when she heard the back door of the house open. Ethan came across the yard slowly, his right arm still held close, moving with the particular stiffness of someone who had slept wrong on top of being injured. He stopped a few feet from the barn door and looked at her. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd look at the fence in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the horses, at the stall she was working, at the pile of dirty straw she'd already moved out. Something moved behind his eyes, but he kept it off his face. "Coffee's on," he said. "If you want it." She did want it, badly, but she said, "After the stall." He stood there another moment, and she could feel him trying to figure out what category she fit into, because she clearly didn't fit into any category he already had. Then he went back inside. She finished the stall, washed her hands at the pump in the yard, and went in. He had made coffee that was too strong and slightly burned, which was fine. She had drunk worse. She sat across the table from him and wrapped both hands around the cup, and he sat on his side with his wrapped arm resting on the table between them, like a piece of evidence. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Better than yesterday." That's not saying a lot. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite annoyance and wasn't quite amusement. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside the window, the light was coming up gold over the eastern hills, and the yard was transitioning from shadow to solid, the outlines of things sharpening. "You need a doctor to look at that in the next day or two," she said. "I'm aware." "Are you going to go?" A pause that went on too long. "Mr. Caldwell." "Doc Ferris is in town on Wednesdays," he said finally. "I'll ride in Wednesday." "That's 4 days." "I know when Wednesday is." She let it alone. Pushing too hard too fast with a man like this, she already understood enough about him from 12 hours of observation to know it would backfire. You didn't pull a pulled muscle. You worked around it until the surrounding tissue was strong enough to support it. She asked him about the fence, and he told her where the replacement posts were stacked behind the smaller barn and where the tools were, and she listened carefully and did not write anything down because she had the kind of memory that retained practical information cleanly and had learned not to make a show of it. "How many head are you running right now?" she asked. Something shifted in his face. 43. She kept her expression neutral. From what Roy Prentice had described and what the land suggested, This operation should have been running 300 head, maybe more. She did not say this. Pasture rotation? She asked instead. North pasture's been fallow since spring. I was supposed to rotate them in last month. He stopped. She could see him adding up all the things he was supposed to have done last month. It was clearly a long list. I'll check the north fence today too, she said. He looked at her. What exactly do you want in exchange for this? Room and board for now, she said. We can talk about wages when the ranch is in a position to support them. That could be a long time. Maybe, she said. Or maybe not. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Why are you doing this? And don't say because you need the work. You could get work in town. You already got work in town, from what I understand. She was mildly surprised he knew that already, then not surprised. Small towns processed information the way fire processes dry grass. I could, she said, but washing dishes for Mabel Couch for $2 a week doesn't get me anywhere. This might. This ranch is in trouble, he said flatly. I can see that. Real trouble, not just fence post trouble. She waited. He looked at the table. Victor Hale's been after this land for 2 years. He's got a lawyer in Tucson who sends papers every few months that basically say, I owe things I don't owe, and I should sell before it gets worse. I haven't sold, but I haven't had the money or the energy to fight it properly either. And I think... He stopped, started again, more carefully. I think he's been waiting for me to get low enough that I stop fighting. There it was. The thing underneath the neglected fences and the empty stalls and the man with an infected arm sleeping in a chair. This wasn't just grief and overwork. There was a pressure being applied, steadily, from outside. She had felt it the moment Mabel mentioned the water. What does Hale want with your land specifically? She asked. The creek. Mabel said something like that. There's a creek on the southeast corner of my property, runs year-round. Only water source in this whole valley that doesn't dry up in summer. He said it without particular emphasis, the way you say a fact that's been a fact for so long, you've stopped feeling the weight of it. Hale owns the land to the east and south. If he gets my property, he controls every drop of water that anybody in this valley needs to run livestock. Every other rancher becomes dependent on whatever rate he wants to charge. Every farmer, every small operation. Eliza set down her coffee cup. And people in town know this? She asked. Some of them. And they're not pushing back? Hale employs 6 men in town, Ethan said. He's got the bank and the freight company. 2 members of the county commission owe him money. Pushing back has costs most people can't afford. He looked at her with the flat honesty of a man who has thought about this for too long. I'm the only one who can hold this specific line, and I've been doing a pretty poor job of it. She was quiet for a moment. What do the papers from the lawyer actually say? She asked. The specific claims. He looked at her. Why? Because legal threats are only threatening if you don't know what they actually say. Sometimes they're bluffing. Sometimes there's a real problem that can be addressed. I'd like to read them if you have them. He stared at her for a long moment. You can read legal documents? My father had a land dispute with a neighbor when I was 24, she said. We couldn't afford a lawyer, so I read everything myself and figured out what actually mattered. We won. She paused. It took 2 years, but we won. Something changed in his face. It was subtle. Not hope exactly, because hope was something he was apparently conserving very carefully, dispensing in quantities too small to be visible. But something. They're in the back room, he said, in the wooden box under the window. She spent the morning on the east fence, replacing the 2 worst posts and resetting 3 others that were leaning but not yet fallen. And she let the legal documents sit in her mind while her hands worked because that was how she processed complicated things. She let them run alongside the physical work, parallel, and eventually the shape of them became clearer. The work itself was harder than she'd anticipated because the ground was different from Ohio ground. Arizona ground in April was a specific kind of hard that seemed to have opinions about being disturbed, and she'd had to soak 2 of the post holes for 20 minutes before they'd cooperate. She'd found the tools Ethan described, sorted through them with the practiced eye of someone who knows which tools are still useful and which are theater, and worked steadily through the morning without stopping except once to drink from the canteen she'd filled at the pump. Halfway through the 3rd post, she heard hooves on the road. She looked up. There were two riders. They slowed when they reached the section of fence she was working, and the one in front, a heavy-set man in a gray hat with a face that had the particular quality of someone who has never had to apologize for anything, looked down at her from his horse with the expression of a man who has found something unexpected and is still deciding whether it's a problem. "Morning," he said, in a tone that made the word mean something else. She drove the post 2 more inches with the mallet before she looked up again. "Morning. Don't think I've seen you before. I've only just arrived. Working for Caldwell?" She didn't answer that directly. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The man in the gray hat smiled in the way that some men smile when they want to establish that they are being pleasant, and that the pleasantness is a choice they're making which could be unmade. "Just checking in on the property," he said. "Mr. Hale likes to keep an eye on his neighbors." "That's considerate of him," she said. "Mr. Caldwell around?" "He's in the house." "Maybe we'll just ride up and say hello." "Maybe," she said. "You'll tell me your names first so I can let him know who's come calling." The smile held, but the eyes behind it cooled slightly. "Tom Draper," he said. "I work for Mr. Hale." She nodded once, picked up her mallet, and turned back to the fence post with the body language of someone whose attention had moved on. She felt both riders watching her for a long moment. Then she heard the hooves move toward the house. She waited until they were far enough ahead, then set down the mallet and followed at a walk. By the time she came through the front door, Ethan was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, and Tom Draper was in the front room with his hat in his hands, doing the performance of a man being polite while communicating something impolite. The second rider had stayed outside, which was its own kind of statement. "Just letting you know, Mr. Hale is still very much interested in having a conversation," Draper was saying. "He's a reasonable man. He understands things have been difficult. He's willing to discuss terms that account for—" "I've heard the terms," Ethan said. His voice was flat. "New terms. Improved ones. Tom." "Sir." "I've got work to do," Ethan said. "You tell Hale what you already know, which is that I'm not selling." Draper's gaze moved past Ethan's shoulder to Eliza, where it paused. "Things change," he said pleasantly. "Circumstances change. Mr. Hale just wants you to know the door's open." "The door," Ethan said, "is right there. I'd appreciate you using it." Draper put his hat back on. He was still smiling. He looked at Eliza once more before he turned, a look she read without difficulty. She was a new variable he hadn't expected, and he was cataloging her. And then he went out and she heard him and his partner ride away. Ethan exhaled. She could see the energy it had taken him to hold that conversation upright. Not because of the conversation itself, but because everything depleted him right now. The injury, the weeks of isolation, the grinding arithmetic of a ranch running on too little. That kind of tired didn't just come from the body. "Has he been coming here regularly?" she asked. "Every few weeks," Ethan said. "Different men, same message." "Has he done anything beyond talk?" He moved back to the kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of someone monitoring their energy. 3 months ago, I found a section of my south fence cut clean. Could have been anyone. Wasn't anyone. Persis. He sat down. Lost 4 head through the gap before I found it. Couldn't prove it was Hale's men. She sat down across from him. "But you know it was." "I know it was." She pulled the wooden box she'd retrieved earlier from where she'd left it by the wall and set it on the table between them. "Then we're going to read every one of these and figure out what's real and what's pressure," she said. "And then we're going to start writing things down." He looked at the box. "Writing what down?" "Everything," she said. "The fence, the cattle, Draper coming here today, dates, details, what was said. If this goes anywhere legal, documentation is the difference between having a case and having a story." He was quiet for a long moment. "You think it's going to go somewhere legal?" "I think Victor Hale is not going to stop," she said, "and I think you've been fighting this alone for 2 years and losing ground. That doesn't mean the situation is lost. It means the approach needs to change." He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between skepticism and something older than skepticism. Something that had come after years of the skepticism being justified. I've got 43 cattle and a broken arm and whatever's in that box, he said. I know, she said. Start there. She opened the box. The papers were a mess. Not from carelessness exactly, but from a kind of defeated shuffling, the way documents look when someone has read them enough times to feel sick about them and then put them away because looking at them more didn't help. She sorted them by date first, which was always her method, and then read them in order. Ethan watched her read. She could feel him watching and didn't acknowledge it. She had learned long ago that being watched while working was something you either got comfortable with or let ruin your concentration, and she had gotten comfortable with it. The lawyer's name was Silas Crane, and he was based in Tucson, and he was, she concluded after reading 4 of his letters, extremely skilled at making things sound more legally settled than they actually were. The first letter claimed an unpaid water access fee from 7 years prior. The second alleged that Ethan had agreed verbally to sell a portion of the Southeast Creek access in 1884 and had not honored the agreement. The third referenced a territorial land survey that supposedly showed the property line ran 20 feet east of where Ethan believed it ran, which would put a section of creek bank technically on land owned by Hale. The fourth letter was the most recent, dated 6 weeks ago, and it was the one that had teeth. It referenced all 3 previous claims and suggested that if Ethan could not provide clear documentation disproving each one within 60 days, Hale would be forced to pursue territorial court remedies. She set the letter down. Have you talked to a lawyer? She asked. The only lawyer in Red Valley is a man named Gaines, Ethan said. He does wills and property transfers. He looked at this about a year ago and said Crane's claims were likely exaggerated, but he wasn't sure about the survey one, and if Crane pushed it to territorial court, it would cost more to fight than the land was worth. Gaines is wrong about that, she said. How do you know? Because Gaines is calculating based on the land value without the creek, she said. If Hale gets the creek, the land value of every property in this valley changes. Any lawyer who understands what's actually at stake would know this isn't just about your 40 acres of southeast pasture. She tapped the fourth letter. This is a bluff built on top of a bluff, built on top of a real problem, which is the survey question. Everything else is theater. He was looking at her differently now. Not the way he'd looked at her when she arrived. That had been the cautious, slightly hostile assessment of a man who didn't understand why a stranger was at his door. This was something more careful, something that suggested he was recalculating. The survey, he said. Can that be challenged? Surveys can always be challenged if you have the original records or a counter-survey done by a licensed assessor, she said. Do you have anything from when your family first took this land? He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the back room and came back with a tin that had once held tobacco and now held a folded piece of paper so old it had gone soft at the creases. He set it in front of her. She unfolded it with care. It was a hand-drawn land map, dated 1871, signed by a territorial assessor whose name she didn't recognize. It showed the Caldwell property boundaries in clear ink, with the creek marked on the southeast corner at a position that was clearly, obviously not 20 feet east of where Crane's survey claimed. She looked at it for a long time. This is original documentation, she said. My father drew that up when he first filed, Ethan said, had the assessor sign it. Do you know if the assessor who did Hale's survey is the same one? Different man. Hale brought him in from Phoenix. She looked up. A private surveyor brought in specifically by Hale. Yes. She folded the map back along its original creases with tremendous care and set it to the side. Then we have something, she said. Not everything, but something. For the first time since she'd walked through that door, Ethan Caldwell looked at the stack of papers on his table without the expression of a man looking at something he'd already lost. He looked at them the way you look at a problem when you've just been reminded that problems have solutions. It didn't last long. He pulled it back, tucked it away, returned to the careful neutrality he'd been wearing since she arrived. But she had seen it. I'll need to go into town, she said. There are records in the county office, land filings that should be public. I want to see whether Hale has been doing this to anyone else. He has, Ethan said quietly. The Pearson place sold 2 years ago. The Widow McAllister sold last fall. Did they sell because they wanted to or because they ran out of options? He said nothing, which was the answer. She put the legal papers back in order, stacked them neatly, and placed the original map on top. She looked at the back room where she'd slept on the floor, then at the yard through the window where the afternoon light was going gold, and she still had the north fence to check. "I'm going to need paper," she said, "and ink, and I'm going to start keeping a record of everything that happens on this property. If Draper comes back, I'm writing it down. If cattle go missing, I'm writing it down. Every date, every detail." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" he asked again. The same question as this morning, but it meant something different now. She thought about it honestly, the way you think about things when you're tired enough that the performance of simplicity takes more effort than the truth. She thought about Caleb Mercer on that train platform, about the $25 in the envelope, about the hotel room in Red Valley and the particular quality of sitting on the edge of a bed in a strange town with no clear next step. "Because I walked in here with nothing," she said, "and found out you almost had nothing either, and I've spent my whole life making something out of almost nothing. It's about the only thing I'm genuinely good at." He didn't say anything right away. Outside, one of the horses made a sound, that low exhale they make when they're settling for the night, and the last of the day's heat was holding in the walls of the house. "The paper and ink are in the desk drawer in the back room," he said finally. "Bottom drawer. There's a pen too if the nib isn't too rusted." She checked the north fence before dark. 2 sections needed work, but nothing was down. She stood at the north edge of the property in the cooling evening and looked south across the land toward the house and the barns and the shape of the whole operation laid out below her, and she thought about what Ethan had said about the creek, only water source in this whole valley that doesn't dry up in summer. And she looked southeast and could just make out the thin glint of it in the last of the light. That was what this was all about, that thin line of water moving through red rock. She understood, standing there, that she had not walked into a simple situation. She had walked into the edge of something large, something that had been building before she arrived and would keep building regardless of what she did. But she also understood that she was here, and she was not leaving, and she had read Silas Crane's letters and found the holes in them, and she had seen the original survey map in its tobacco tin, and she had watched Tom Draper look at her like she was a problem he hadn't accounted for. She didn't mind being a problem. She walked back to the house in the dark, and she ate the meal she'd put together from what was in the pantry. Not much, but enough. And Ethan ate without commenting on it, which was the best kind of compliment from a man like that. And after dinner, she found the paper and pen in the bottom drawer of the desk, and she sat down and began to write. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote a description of the property as she had observed it. She wrote about Tom Draper's visit and what he had said and the time he had arrived and left. She wrote about the cut fence from 3 months prior as Ethan had described it, noting it as hearsay for now, to be verified. She wrote carefully and without decoration, the way she wrote everything, and when she looked up from the page, the candle had burned down 2 inches, and the house was quiet, and Ethan had apparently gone to bed at some point without her noticing. She sat in the lamplight and looked at the page covered in her own handwriting and thought about the fact that $66 and a train ticket had brought her here, to this specific table, to this specific fight, in this specific valley where the only thing that mattered was a creek that ran year-round. She wasn't sure yet whether that was terrible luck or the opposite. She added one more line to the document, a note about the water, its location, its strategic value, the fact that it was the center of gravity for everything happening on this land. And then she capped the ink and went to her place on the floor of the back room and lay down in the dark. Sleep came faster than it had the night before. That was the thing about days when you actually did something. They ended more solidly, pressed you down into rest in a way that days of waiting never did. She had fixed a fence and read legal papers and met Tom Draper and found a survey map in a tobacco tin and started a written record that hadn't existed before. She had not fixed the ranch, not yet. But she had done what she always did at the beginning of something hard. She had started. Wednesday came with a low gray sky that threatened rain and didn't deliver, which Eliza was learning was characteristic of this part of Arizona. The sky made promises it had no intention of keeping. Ethan rode into town for his appointment with Doc Ferris, and Eliza used the hours of his absence to do what she'd been planning since the previous evening. She walked the entire property line. All of it. She carried the original survey map from the tobacco tin, now wrapped in a piece of oilcloth she'd found in the barn, and she walked from the northwest corner to the northeast, and down the east side and across the south, and back up the west, and she took her time at each corner, checking the marker posts where they existed and noting where they didn't. It took 4 hours. Her boots were not made for this terrain. Ohio dirt was forgiving in a way Arizona ground simply wasn't, and by the time she reached the southeast corner near the creek, she had a blister on her left heel she was actively ignoring. The creek was smaller than she'd imagined from the way Ethan talked about it, but she understood immediately why it mattered. It ran clear, which was itself remarkable in this landscape, and it ran steadily, not the desperate trickle of a waterway making its last effort before the summer heat finished it off. She followed it north for about 100 yards and then south for about the same, and she checked the position against the map twice, and she stood at the southeast corner marker, a flat rock with a chisel mark her instincts said was original and not recent, and looked east across the fence line into what was clearly Hale's property. Someone had moved the fence. It was subtle. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't see it, and even looking for it, you could second-guess yourself because the moved section was only about 15 feet, and the posts were old enough to have weathered convincingly. But she had the original map in her hands, and she had paced the distances carefully, and the math was clear. The fence that currently ran along the southeast boundary of the Caldwell property was not in the same position as the boundary described in the 1871 filing. It was 15 feet east of where it should be, which put 15 feet of creek bank, including, crucially, the flattest and most accessible section of bank, on the wrong side of the line. She stood there for a long time looking at it. This was not a surveying disagreement. This was not a matter of historical imprecision in the original filing. Someone had moved that fence at some point after it was originally installed, moved it with enough care and patience that it would look like age and weather had always had it sitting there. And then Victor Hale's private surveyor from Phoenix had come out and measured from the moved fence and concluded, with the straight face of a professional being paid for a specific conclusion, that the creek bank belonged to Hale. She took the piece of paper she'd brought in her coat pocket and wrote down every measurement she'd taken, every marker post she'd found, the exact position of the fence relative to the corner marker, the condition of the posts. She wrote the date and the time and signed her own name to it, because a document without a signature was a document anyone could disavow. Then she walked back to the house with her blister and her notes and a cold, clear anger that she was careful not to let run away with her, because anger without direction was useless and she had too much to do. When Ethan came back from town in the early afternoon, she was at the kitchen table with the survey map unfolded and her notes beside it. He came in and looked at her face before he looked at anything else, and whatever he read there made him set his hat on the peg by the door with more deliberateness than usual. "The fence on the southeast corner has been moved," she said. He went still. 15 feet east," she said. "The corner marker is still where it was. It's a rock, hard to move without it being obvious. But the fence line has been pulled east to put that section of creek bank over the property line." She turned her notes so he could read them. "This is what I measured this morning." He sat down. He looked at the notes. He looked at the map. He sat there for a long moment, and she could see him running through the timeline of it in his head, trying to figure out when it had happened, and from the look on his face, she thought he might be calculating that it had happened while he was at his worst, in the months after his wife died, when the ranch had gone to minimum, and he'd been barely functional, and that possibility seemed to hit him somewhere specific. "Doc Ferris says the arm is going to be fine," he said, which was not a response to what she told him, but was also the most information he'd volunteered about himself since she'd arrived. "I'm glad," she said, and waited. He looked at the map again. "If the fence was moved, then Hale's survey is based on a fraudulent boundary," she said, "which means the legal claims in Crane's letters are built on evidence that was manufactured. That's not a land dispute anymore. That's fraud." The words sat between them on the table. "Can you prove it?" he asked. "Not alone," she said, "but the corner marker proves where the boundary was originally set. The original filing proves where the fence should be. If we can get a licensed independent assessor out here to measure from the corner marker, We can produce a counter-survey that contradicts Crane's survey directly. Then it becomes his paid surveyor's word against an independent assessment with original documentation. He rubbed his face with his good hand. It was a gesture she'd seen a few times now. Not frustration exactly, more like a man clearing condensation off a window so he could see through it. An independent assessor costs money, he said. I know. I don't have it. I know that too. She paused. But I've been thinking about what you said, about the Pearson place and the widow McAllister. If Hale is doing this systematically, moving fences, bringing in a compliant surveyor, using legal threats to pressure people into selling, there might be other landowners in this valley who have the same problem and don't know it. And if there are, the cost of fighting this doesn't have to fall on you alone. He looked at her. Who would you talk to? He said. That depends on who you trust, she said. You've been here your whole life. I've been here 4 days. You know this valley and these people in a way I don't. He thought about it. She could see him sorting through names, weighing them. Jim Farrow, he said finally. He runs a small cattle operation north of here. Hale tried to buy him out last year and he refused. And there's a woman named Clara Reyes. Her husband died 3 years ago and she's been running their place alone, east side of the valley. Hale hasn't approached her yet, far as I know, but her land is on the water table. Could you get word to them? I could ride out to Farrow's tomorrow, he said, if the arm holds. I'll come with you, she said. He looked like he was going to say something about that, then didn't. She went back out that afternoon to check on the cattle in the north pasture, which she'd been rotating in 2 days earlier, and she was counting heads, 41, not 43, which sent a spike of concern through her she couldn't immediately resolve. When she heard horses on the north road. Fast horses. More than one. She turned. 3 riders coming from the direction of town, cutting across the open ground at a pace that was too purposeful for casual travel. She didn't recognize the men, but she recognized the pace, and she recognized the formation, the deliberate positioning of people who wanted to look like they had the numbers to back up whatever they'd come to say. They pulled up about 20 yards from where she was standing. The one in front was not Tom Draper. He was younger, harder-faced, with the kind of eyes that calculated everything in terms of what it would cost to remove it. He looked her over the way Draper had, but without the performance of pleasantness. We're looking for Caldwell, he said. He's not in the pasture, she said. Where's he? On his property, she said, which is where you are too, without an invitation. The man's jaw tightened slightly. I've got a message for him from Mr. Hale. You can give it to me, she said. I'll make sure he gets it. The message is not for you. Then the message will have to wait, she said. Mr. Caldwell is not available to receive visitors right now. If Mr. Hale would like to arrange a meeting, he's welcome to send a written request to the house. The man stared at her. The 2 riders behind him were still. One of them had his hand resting near his hip in a way that was meant to be noticed. This ain't Ohio, the man said. He said it quietly, which was worse than if he'd said it loud. She held his gaze. No, she agreed. It's not. She didn't move and didn't look away. But a man's property is a man's property in any territory, and you're standing on the wrong side of the fence. I'd appreciate it if you'd take Mr. Hale's message back to him and suggest he find a more appropriate method of communication. A long moment. The kind that has weight in it. Then the man turned his horse without a word, and the 2 riders behind him followed, and they rode back the way they'd come. She stood in the pasture and waited until they were out of sight. Then she exhaled. Then she walked the perimeter of the north pasture again, looking for her missing 2 cattle, and found one of them in a low spot behind a stand of dry brush with a stone in her left front hoof, limping but not seriously injured. The second was simply farther west than she'd counted, half behind the fence line, hidden by the angle. 43. She got the stone out of the cow's hoof with a patience she had to manufacture because her hands wanted to shake slightly from the encounter on the road, and she didn't want to hurt the animal with unsteady hands. She worked slowly. The cow was not cooperative about it, but she was not vicious about it either, and eventually the thing came free, and Eliza wiped her hands on her trousers and stood up, and the cow walked away without acknowledging any of it. She went back to the house and told Ethan about the 3 riders, and he went quiet in a particular way. A still, focused quiet that was different from his usual withdrawn quiet. The first was the quiet of a man who had given up processing things. The second was the quiet of a man who was processing something very carefully. The young one with the hard face, he said. Description sounds like Hale's foreman. Name's Cord Bledsoe. He knew I was from Ohio, she said. Ethan looked up at her. He said that specifically? Yes. She paused. Which means Hale has been asking questions about me. Ethan set down the coffee cup he'd picked up. Why would he bother? Because I showed up 4 days ago with no obvious connections and no resources and immediately started working on your ranch, she said. To someone watching this property, that's unusual. He wants to know if I'm a problem. Are you? Ethan said. She looked at him. He was watching her with something that wasn't quite humor, but was in the neighborhood of it. I'm trying to be, she said. The next morning they rode to Jim Farrow's place, which was 11 miles north on a road that was more suggestion than road in several places. And Ethan rode with his right arm careful but functional, and they didn't talk much for the first few miles because there wasn't much to say that the landscape wasn't already saying. The valley spread out below them as the road climbed slightly, and you could see from this elevation how the water moved through it, or rather how it would move through it in summer when the seasonal creeks dried up, and the only thing left was the line of green that marked Caldwell's Creek from half a mile away. Jim Farrow was in his barn when they arrived, and he came out wiping grease off his hands with a rag that wasn't helping. He was a compact man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades reading weather from open ground. He looked at Ethan and then at Eliza and then back at Ethan with an expression that was curious rather than suspicious. Heard you'd had some trouble, he said to Ethan. Had some and got some still, Ethan said. This is Eliza Hartwell. She's been helping at the ranch. Farrow nodded at her with the directness of a man who doesn't perform social rituals he doesn't mean. Come inside, he said. They sat at his kitchen table and Eliza laid out what she'd found at the southeast corner fence, with the measurements and the notes and the position of the corner marker, and Farrow listened without interrupting and then sat there for a moment running the rag through his hands in a slow, unconscious loop. I walked my south fence last fall, he said carefully. What did you find? Eliza asked. Thought I found drift, he said. Some posts that had moved over the years seemed like. Didn't think much of it because the section in question isn't good grazing anyway. It's rocky, but... He stopped, looked at the notes. But Hale's property runs along my south line. Eliza watched him arrive at the understanding she'd already arrived at. If he moved your post too, she said, and then brought in his surveyor, he would have a claim on my south pasture, Farrow said. He said it in a flat, careful tone that was holding something considerably less flat underneath it, which is exactly what that lawyer in Tucson suggested I might have a problem with in the letter I got in February. Ethan looked at Eliza. She looked back. Did you keep the letter? She asked Farrow. I keep everything, he said, and stood up. He came back with a box not entirely unlike Ethan's box, except Farrow's was organized, the papers in date order, each letter folded neatly. The lawyer was the same, Silas Crane, Tucson, and the letter was the same style, the same constructed vagueness that sounded authoritative, but was careful not to say anything specific enough to be proven false. Has Hale approached you about buying? She asked. Twice, Farrow said. Last summer and again in January. I told him no both times. He'll come again, she said, with the South Pasture claim ready to use as leverage. Farrow put his hands flat on the table. He was not a man who showed a lot on his face, but what was showing now was a cold, deliberate anger that had apparently been waiting for a context that made sense of it. What are you proposing? He said. An independent survey of both properties, she said, conducted by an assessor from the territorial office, not hired by anyone with an interest in the outcome. If the fences on both properties have been moved to match Hale's claimed boundaries, we have evidence of a coordinated pattern, not two separate disputes. A pattern is harder to dismiss. Cost of an independent assessor, Farrow said. Split between properties, it becomes manageable, she said. And if Clara Reyes is in a similar position, she will be, Farrow said. He said it with the certainty of someone who had been watching the pattern longer than he'd understood it. Her east fence runs along Hale's north line. I've ridden past her place. Something looks off about that fence line. I figured I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it, Eliza said. Farrow looked at Ethan. You trust her? He asked, in the direct way of a man who expects a direct answer. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I do, he said. Pharaoh nodded slowly. All right, he said. Let's talk about the assessor. They rode to Clara Reyes's property on the east side of the valley that same afternoon. Eliza had expected someone worn down by years of solo operation, and Clara Reyes was worn down. That part was accurate, but she was also formidably clear-eyed in the way of people who have had every comfortable illusion removed and have discovered they can function without them. She was perhaps 45, with dark hair shot through with silver, and the efficient movements of someone who had long since stopped doing anything unnecessarily. She looked at Eliza's notes, and at the survey map, and at the letter Crane had sent her, which had arrived only 3 weeks ago, and which she had been sitting with in the specific dread of a person who has identified a threat but doesn't yet know how to address it. And she said, "So he's doing this to all of us?" "We believe so," Eliza said. "How many others?" Clara asked. "We don't know yet," Eliza said. "The Pearson property sold 2 years ago. The widow McAllister sold last fall. We don't know if this was part of the pattern or coincidence." "It's not coincidence," Clara said flatly. "Mrs. McAllister told me before she left that she'd had men come to her property twice and she'd been scared. She didn't say of what. She just left." She paused. "I thought at the time it was grief. Her husband had only been gone a year." The room went quiet for a moment with the weight of that. "If we bring this to the territorial office," Clara said, "what happens?" "That depends on the evidence we can produce," Eliza said. The corner markers on Ethan's property, the original 1871 filing, the counter survey, the letters from Crane. If we can show a coordinated effort to falsify boundaries across multiple properties and connect it to Hale through his private surveyor and through Crane, we have a fraud case that the territorial office can't ignore. Not something they can dismiss as a local land dispute between neighbors. "Can't ignore and won't ignore are different things," Clara said. "Yes," Eliza said, "they are. But we need the evidence before we can find out which one it is." Clara looked at her for a long moment, the direct, assessing look of a woman who had learned to read people quickly because slow reading was a luxury she couldn't afford. "All right," she said. "I'll walk my east fence with you tomorrow, and you can measure." On the ride back to the Caldwell Ranch in the late afternoon, Eliza and Ethan were quiet for longer than they'd been quiet that morning, which was a different kind of quiet. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of too many things. "Pharaoh asked if I trusted you," Ethan said eventually. "I know." "You're not going to ask why I said yes?" "You'll tell me if you want me to know," she said. He rode for a while. The light was going long and orange across the valley, and the shadows were reaching east, and the creek on the southeast corner of his property caught the light briefly, a glint she could see from half a mile away. "You've been here less than a week," he said, "and you've done more toward actually solving this than I've managed in 2 years." "You were managing it alone," she said. "I was barely managing anything." She didn't argue with that because it was true and he knew it. And arguing with true things people say about themselves is its own kind of condescension. "You held on," she said. "That's not nothing. A lot of people would have sold." "I thought about it," he said, "more than once." "What stopped you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "My father's marker rock on the southeast corner. I kept thinking about him putting it there, hauling it with a team and setting it exactly where the assessor told him the corner was. He was deliberate about things. He believed in doing them right." He paused. "Selling would have been giving Hale that rock. I couldn't make myself do it." She thought about her father's farm in Ohio, about the morning she'd signed the papers to sell it, the specific grief of that, not the grief she'd expected for the land or the house, but an unexpected grief for the version of herself who had believed the farm would always be there, even when she'd known it wouldn't be. "Your father would have approved of what you're doing now," she said. Ethan said nothing. "I mean, fighting it properly," she said, "with evidence, not just refusing and waiting." "Maybe," he said. They rode back to the ranch as the last of the light failed. She fed the horses while he checked the south pasture, and when they came back to the house, she made supper from what was in the pantry. She'd reorganized the pantry 2 days ago and stretched what was there further than it looked like it should go, a skill from years of Ohio winters, and they ate without talking much, both of them turning over the day's information in their own heads. After supper, she spread her notes across the table and began organizing them into a formal written account, a document rather than a field record, something that could be handed to a person in authority and read without context. She worked for 2 hours. Ethan sat across from her reading one of the letters from Crane again, and she knew he was reading it differently now than he had before, reading it as a document built on a fraudulent foundation rather than as a threat he didn't know how to counter. "There's something I should have told you earlier," he said without looking up from the letter. She waited. "About 6 weeks ago," he said, "before the arm. I was checking the south fence and I found tracks. More than 2 men, horses, coming from the east across Hale's property line, at night from the age of the prince." He set the letter down. "I followed them and found a section of fence near the southeast corner that had been disturbed, moved back and forth, like someone had been testing it or measuring something." She kept her face neutral. "Did you write it down?" "No." "Do you remember the approximate date?" He thought. "3rd week of March, I think. The arm went bad the week after." She picked up her pen and wrote it down. "Date approximate," she noted, per owner's recollection. "Tracks found near southeast corner, originating from adjacent property owned by Victor Hale. Evidence of fence disturbance at same location. Owner did not document at time due to subsequent injury." She added his initials at the end of the note and turned the page so he could read it and asked him if it was accurate. He read it. "Yes," he said. "Sign it," she said. "With today's date." He signed it. She blotted it and set it to the side and picked up the next page of her account and kept writing. Ethan watched her for a moment. "You really think this is going to work?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I think we have a better chance than we did a week ago," she said. "I think Hale has been running this scheme long enough that he's gotten confident, and confident people make mistakes because they stop covering things carefully." She didn't look up from the page. "And I think he underestimated you." "He didn't underestimate me," Ethan said. "He sized me up correctly. I was barely functional." "He underestimated that you'd let someone help you," she said. "He was quiet." "Most men in your position would have told me to leave," she said. "The day I arrived. Most men would have said they didn't need help and pushed me off the property out of pride and kept deteriorating alone until they ran out of options." She glanced up. "You didn't do that." "Almost did," he said. "Almost doesn't count," she said, and went back to writing. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but in that direction. The closest thing to one she'd heard from him yet. She wrote 3 more pages before the candle got too low. She capped the ink, stacked the pages, and looked at what they'd built in the span of a week. A written record, an original survey map, a signed eyewitness account, 2 allied landowners with similar evidence, and a plan to bring in an independent assessor who owed nothing to Victor Hale. It wasn't enough yet. But the thing about not enough was that it was always the condition that came directly before enough, if you kept working. She blew out the candle and went to her place in the back room and lay down in the dark that was becoming familiar now. The particular smell of the house settling into something she recognized, and she listened to the desert quiet outside and thought about Tom Draper and Cord Bledsoe and Silas Crane in Tucson, and Victor Hale in whatever comfortable house he occupied while other people's fences got moved in the night. She thought about the creek catching the last of the afternoon light. She thought about Jim Farrow's face when he understood what had been done to him, and Clara Reyes saying so, "He's doing this to all of us," in a tone that had turned something from dread into something considerably more durable. She thought about Ethan's father's marker rock, sitting exactly where it had always been, waiting for someone to measure from it correctly. She was almost asleep when she heard it, faint, from the direction of the south pasture, the sound of cattle moving when cattle shouldn't be moving. She was on her feet and pulling on her boots in the dark before she was fully awake. She went out the back door into the dark with the lantern unlit because light would announce her before she could see anything useful, and she moved toward the south pasture by memory and by the sound. The cattle were not running, not panicked, but moving in that low, restless way that meant something had disturbed them and they hadn't decided yet what to do about it. She stopped at the pasture fence and listened. 2 sounds beneath the cattle movement. Horses, standing still. The particular held-breath sound of horses being kept quiet by riders who didn't want to be heard. And underneath that, something lower, a rhythmic scrape she couldn't identify for a moment, and then did. A post being worked loose from hardened ground. She turned and ran back to the house. Ethan was already in the kitchen when she came through the door, which meant he'd heard it too. He was pulling on his coat with the careful, one-armed efficiency she'd seen him develop over the past week, and he had the rifle from the front room in his good hand. "How many?" he said. "Horses, at least 2, she said. "Someone working the south fence." His jaw set. Same section as before. "Do not go out there with the rifle," she said. He looked at her. "If you fire on them and hit someone, it becomes your problem regardless of whose fault it is," she said. She was already moving to the table, finding the paper and pen in the dark by feel. "Light the lamp and get me a time." "Eliza, the clock," she said. "What time is it?" He looked at the clock on the wall. 2:15. She wrote it down. She wrote the date. She wrote what she had heard and from which direction and how long it had taken her to wake Ethan. Her hand was not perfectly steady, but it was close enough. "Now take the lantern," she said, "and we go out together and we let them see us. Don't raise the rifle unless they come at us. We're not trying to stop them tonight. We're trying to document that it happened." He stared at her for 2 full seconds. She could see him fighting every instinct that was telling him to go out there and end this the way men in his position had been ending things for 100 years. She held his gaze and did not move. "All right," he said. It came out rough. They went out together, Eliza carrying the lit lantern and Ethan with the rifle lowered at his side, and they walked toward the south pasture at a normal pace, not running, the lantern throwing a wide circle of yellow light that anyone watching would see from 50 yards out. By the time they reached the south fence line, the horses were gone. The sound had stopped. The cattle were still uneasy, bunched toward the north end of the pasture, and she moved the lantern slowly along the south fence until she found what she was looking for. 2 posts had been fully removed. The wire between them was down and coiled back far enough that a man on horseback could have moved 8 or 10 cattle through the gap before anyone would notice. The ground around the removed posts was freshly disturbed, darker than the surrounding ground, and she could see at the edge of the lantern light the hoof prints going east, back toward Hale's property. She handed Ethan the lantern and crouched down and looked at the prints as carefully as she could in the uncertain light. 3 horses. Shod, all of them. Specific pattern on 2 of them. The rear left shoe on one horse had a chip she could make out as a distinctive break in the print. She stood up and took the lantern back and walked the fence line in both directions, counting the cattle she could see, and Ethan walked the other direction, and they met back at the gap after 10 minutes. "I count 39, he said. 4 head gone. Through a gap that had been opened in less than 30 minutes, quietly, by men who had clearly done this before. She went back to the house and wrote all of it down. The hoof prints, the count, the direction, the chipped shoe, the condition of the removed posts, the time she and Ethan had arrived at the fence, the time they had confirmed the missing cattle. She wrote it in the same flat, factual register she used for everything, because a document that sounded emotional was a document that could be dismissed, and she was not going to give anyone that opportunity. Ethan came back in while she was finishing. He leaned the rifle against the wall and sat down with the slow movement of someone who has burned through the last of their adrenaline and found nothing good underneath it. 4 head, he said. Yes. That's not nothing. At current prices, I know what it is, she said. She capped the ink and looked at him. I need you to listen to me about something, and I need you to hear it as a practical statement, not as someone minimizing what just happened. He waited. This is good, she said. He looked at her. Not the cattle, she said. The cattle are a loss, and that's real. But what happened tonight is the first time we have a documented incident with enough physical evidence to be useful. The hoof prints, the timing, the direction of movement, this is something an investigator can work with. She set her hand flat on the papers. They did this thinking it would push you closer to the edge. Instead, they handed us exactly what we needed. He looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he looked at her with something behind his eyes she didn't quite know how to read. It wasn't gratitude exactly, because gratitude implies a transaction, and whatever was happening in his expression was more complicated than that. You think like someone who's been in a fight before, he said. Different kind of fight, she said. Same principle. You don't get to choose when the evidence arrives. You just have to be ready to collect it when it does. He nodded slowly. Outside, the cattle had settled, the bunched anxiety releasing now that the disturbance was gone, and the desert went back to its characteristic silence, unbothered. I'll ride to Pharaoh's at first light, he said. And I'll ride to Clara's, she said. We need to check their fences tomorrow. If Hale moved tonight, he may have moved on all 3 properties. In the morning, that was exactly what they found. Clara Reyes's east fence had a section down. Not cattle gone, but the fence itself compromised in the same manner. Posts removed with deliberate care, the ground disturbed in a pattern that matched what Eliza had documented at the Caldwell Ranch. Clara stood looking at it with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman who has gone past anger into something colder and more useful. Same night? Clara asked. Same night, Eliza said. How many men, you think? At least 3 at Ethan's. Possibly a second group came here. Eliza crouched and looked at the prints around the disturbed posts. Different horses from the ones at the Caldwell Ranch. Different shoe patterns. Different gait spacing. Yes, different horses. Coordinated, but separate teams. Clara looked at the prints for a long time. He sent 2 groups out in the same night, she said. That's not someone being cautious. That's someone who thinks he's already won. People who think they've already won get sloppy, Eliza said. Jim Farrow's north fence had been left alone, which was its own information. Either a third team hadn't materialized, or they'd thought better of it, or Farrow's operation was the least urgent target in Hale's current sequence. Either way, Farrow rode back to Caldwell's with them that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table where they'd spread out all the documentation, and the 4 of them, Eliza, Ethan, Farrow, and Clara, who had ridden over from the east, looked at what they had collectively built. It was more than Eliza had allowed herself to hope for this quickly. 5 separate documented incidents across 2 properties in 2 weeks. The original survey map, Farrow's letter from Crane and Ethan's stack of letters, and Clara's single letter, all from the same lawyer, all following the same constructed framework of vague legal threat. The survey map discrepancy at the southeast corner, the moved fence documentation with physical measurements, and now 2 nights of fence interference with hoofprint evidence and timing records. We need to get this to the Territorial Land Office, Farrow said. In Tucson. Yes, Eliza said. But not just dropped off at the door. We need someone in that office who will actually look at it, not file it and forget it. I know a man, Clara said. Everyone looked at her. My husband dealt with the land office when we first filed our property. There was an investigator there named Holt, Thomas Holt, honest man. My husband said he was the only one in that office who treated small landowners the same as large ones. She paused. I don't know if he's still there. I'll find out, Eliza said. Ethan was looking at her. He did that sometimes now. Looked at her with a focus that was different from his early suspicious watchfulness, more direct. Like he was paying attention to something specific, rather than assessing a general unknown. She had noticed it and not commented on it, because commenting on it would require having a conversation she didn't have the mental bandwidth for while also managing a fraud case. You'd go to Tucson, he said. Someone needs to deliver this in person, she said. Documents sent through the mail can be lost, or intercepted, or delayed until they're no longer urgent. She looked at him. Can you manage the ranch for 3 or 4 days? I've been managing it alone for 2 years, he said, and she heard the self-directed edge in it. You've been surviving it, she said. Different thing, but yes, you can manage 4 days. Farrow said he'd checked the Caldwell fences while Ethan's arm was still healing, and Clara said she'd come by every other day with food, which Eliza filed away as something she'd think about later because the domestic detail of it surprised her, and she wasn't sure if it surprised her in a good way or simply in a complicated one. She left for Tucson 2 days later, on the morning stage with the documents in a leather case she'd bought from the dry goods store with what remained of her money and which she kept on her person at every moment of the journey. The stage was not comfortable. The road between Red Valley and Tucson was the kind of road that made you aware of every joint in your body. and her fellow passengers were a commercial traveler with samples of collar pins and a man who appeared to be sleeping but was probably just very still, and she spent most of the ride reviewing the documents in the case one more time, looking for holes. She found two things she wished were stronger. The direct connection between Cord Bledsoe and the fence tampering was circumstantial, built on timing and direction rather than witnesses. And the link between Silas Crane's legal threats and the physical interference on the properties was logical, but not yet documented in a way that showed Crane had knowledge of the fence moves. She noted both weaknesses on a separate page and thought about how to address them. She arrived in Tucson at dusk and found a room in a boarding house near the land office, and ate the meal the landlady offered, and went to bed early, which she had promised herself she would do because she needed to be sharp in the morning, and she was aware she'd been running on shorter sleep than was sustainable. The territorial land office opened at 8. She was there at 7:55. Thomas Holt was still there. He was a lean man somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of desk that told you something about him, organized, nothing superfluous, a single photograph facing toward him rather than toward visitors. He looked at her over his glasses when she came in and asked how he could help her in the tone of a man who expects the answer to be straightforward and hopes it won't take long. She put the leather case on his desk and said, "I have documentation of a coordinated fraud campaign against 3 landowners in the Red Valley Territory, conducted over at least 2 years, involving falsified boundary surveys, systematic fence tampering, and a pattern of manufactured legal threats from an attorney named Silas Crane of this city." Holt looked at her over his glasses for a moment. Then he looked at the leather case. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He went through the documents methodically, reading each one fully before moving to the next, and she had the sense that this was genuinely how he read things, rather than a performance of thoroughness for her benefit. He asked occasional questions, direct, specific questions that told her he understood what he was looking at, and she answered each one with the same directness, without embellishment, without the urgency she felt pressing against the back of her ribs. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at her. "The counter-survey hasn't been done yet," he said. It was the most significant gap in the evidence, and they both knew it. "No," she said. "We need an assessor from this office to conduct it. One with no connection to the private surveyor Hale hired from Phoenix." Name of the private surveyor? She gave it to him. She had found it in the text of Crane's most recent letter, referenced obliquely, as confirmed by the professional assessment of Mr. D. Garfield, certified land assessor. She had written it in her notes the moment she found it. Holt wrote it down. Something in his expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, not the theatrical recognition of a movie villain's name, just a small shift in the way he held his jaw. She noticed it. "You know that name," she said. He looked at her. "Mr. Garfield has appeared in one other land dispute in this territory in the past 3 years," he said carefully. "His assessment was also contested. The matter was eventually settled without requiring an investigation." He set his pen down. "But I remember it." She let that sit. "I would like to send one of our assessors to the Red Valley properties," he said, "before any further action is taken." "When?" she asked. "End of the week," he said. "Possibly early next week. We have—" "Mr. Holt," she said. "Hale's men took 4 cattle from the Caldwell property 8 days ago. They compromised a fence line on the Reyes property the same night. The pattern is accelerating. I don't think we have the luxury of next week." He looked at her. "If I can get an assessor out there by Friday," he said, "would that satisfy the urgency?" "Friday would help considerably," she said. He wrote something in his ledger. She watched him write it, a formal record of the meeting, date, and summary. And something in her chest loosened slightly, the specific tension of carrying something alone releasing when someone else picked up part of the weight. She left the office at 10:30 and walked out into the Tucson morning and stood in the sun for a moment and thought about 4 cattle moving through a gap in a fence in the dark, and Victor Hale in whatever comfortable house, and Silas Crane writing his carefully constructed letters, and a private assessor named Garfield, who had appeared once before in a contest that was settled without investigation. She thought about what settled without investigation meant in practical terms. Someone had either been paid or frightened into dropping it. She wondered which one, and whether that person was reachable. She spent the rest of the day in Tucson finding out. It took most of the afternoon working through the Land Registry Office's public records and a conversation with a clerk who was more forthcoming than he probably should have been, and what she found was this. 2 years ago, a rancher named Aldous Webb had filed a contest against a Garfield survey that placed a portion of his north pasture within the boundary of adjacent land owned by a company whose deed of ownership turned out, when she looked closely at the registry entry, to list Victor Hale as principal shareholder. Webb had withdrawn the contest 6 weeks after filing. She went back to the boarding house and wrote down everything she'd found and added it to the case with a note explaining the significance, then spent an hour writing a formal letter to Thomas Holt, summarizing the Webb connection and requesting that his office attempt to make contact with Aldous Webb directly. She posted the letter that evening before the post office closed. On the stage back to Red Valley the next morning, she sat with the leather case in her lap and watched the landscape change from Tucson's wider streets back to the open territory roads. And she thought about all of it as one connected thing instead of as individual pieces, which was how she'd been thinking about it necessarily while building it, but which didn't give you the same picture. Victor Hale wanted the water. To get the water, he needed the Caldwell property. To get the Caldwell property, with minimum legal risk, he needed to either manufacture a legal claim strong enough to force a sale or weaken Ethan to the point where he'd sell voluntarily. Both required the falsified survey as the foundation. The manufactured claims from Crane kept the legal pressure on. The fence tampering and cattle theft kept the operational pressure on. The 2 men Hale had bought on the county commission provided political cover if anyone made noise locally. And the previous instance with Webb showed the pattern had worked before. Had worked well enough that Webb folded inside 6 weeks. What Hale had not accounted for was a woman with a leather case who had nothing to lose and a functional memory for legal documents. She was back in Red Valley by mid-afternoon. Ethan was at the south fence when she rode in. She could see him from the road, moving along the repaired section with a methodical attention that was different from the early, reluctant maintenance she'd watched him do in the first days. He had the posture of a man who had made a decision about something and was acting from it rather than despite himself. He came back to the house when he saw her arrive, and she told him about Holt and about Webb and about the assessor coming Friday, and she watched his face as she talked, watched it move through something complicated, the particular sequence of a man who has been losing for long enough that good news arrives with suspicion attached. Webb, he said. I know that name. He sold his place and moved to New Mexico. About 18 months ago. Holt's office will try to reach him, she said. If they find him, Ethan said. And if he's willing to talk. Yes, she said. A lot of this is still conditional. She set the leather case on the table. But it was all conditional a week ago, too. We've moved the conditions forward. He looked at the case. Then he looked at her, that focused, specific look she'd been cataloging without intending to. And he said, You're exhausted. She was, actually. The stage roads and the Tucson afternoon and the sustained concentration had pressed down on her in a way she'd been holding at bay, and now that she was back in the kitchen with the familiar smell of the house around her, the holding at bay was losing. I'm fine, she said. You've been on stages and in offices for 2 days, he said. Sit down. I made soup. She looked at him. It's edible, he said. Mostly. She sat down. He put a bowl in front of her and she ate without talking, and he sat across the table doing the same. And outside the south pasture was quiet, and the 39 remaining cattle were where they should be, and the repaired fence line held in the afternoon light. Clara came by yesterday, he said, brought bread. That was kind of her. She asked about you. He turned his spoon in the bowl. Whether you were coming back. Eliza looked at him. Not the way you're thinking, he said, and she could hear something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite humor, somewhere between the two. She's practical. She wanted to know if the plan was still on or whether we needed to adjust. What did you tell her? That you'd be back, he said. I didn't have a reason to think otherwise. She thought about that. About the fact that he'd told Clara she'd be back without apparent doubt, as though her return was a fixed point rather than a variable. She thought about what that meant for a man who had been operating without fixed points for a long time. The assessor comes Friday, she said. I know, he said. After that, we wait for Holt's office to act on what we've given them, she said. That part we can't control. The waiting is going to be hard. I've had practice with hard waiting, he said dryly. Different kind, she said. Waiting while fighting is different from waiting while losing. One of them has direction. He looked at her for a moment. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Say the exact thing that makes the right difference and then move right on like it wasn't anything. She didn't have an answer for that immediately. She ate the last of the soup, which was, in fact, edible. Not good, not seasoned in any identifiable way, but honest and warm and sufficient. She thought about what he'd asked. I grew up saying things plainly, she said finally. My father wasn't much for decoration. Neither was the work. If a fence post is leaning, you say the fence post is leaning. If you need help, you say you need help. She set the spoon down. Most people spend so much energy on how things sound that they lose track of what they're actually saying. He turned his coffee cup in the familiar slow circle. You said something the first morning, he said, that you'd spent your whole life making something out of almost nothing, and it was the only thing you were genuinely good at. I remember. It's not the only thing, he said. It came out quiet, not performing anything, just a man saying a true thing because it was true. She looked at him across the table. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that made everything in the kitchen go warm and specific, and he was looking back at her with a directness that was different from every other directness she'd experienced from him. Not the assessing look of those first days, not the focused attention of a man running through logistics, but something simpler and more unguarded than either. She picked up her bowl and stood up. I'll check the north fence before dark, she said. He let her go. She was grateful for that. She checked the north fence and it was intact, and she walked the east line too, more from habit now than necessity, and she stood at the southeast corner near the marker rock in the lowering light and looked at the boundary that was not where someone had tried to claim it was, the line of the fence still sitting in its fraudulent position, waiting for Friday's assessor to measure it correctly. She put her hand on the marker rock. It was warm from the day's sun, rough under her palm. Ethan's father had put it there. A deliberate man, he'd said. Someone who believed in doing things right. She thought about all the things that had to keep going right between now and the point where Victor Hale's scheme fell apart under the weight of its own documentation. She thought about what could still go wrong. Holt's assessor could be delayed, Webb might not be findable or willing, Crane might file something in territorial court before they were ready to respond. Hale might escalate again, something worse than fence posts and 4 cattle in the night. She thought about the look on Ethan's face across the kitchen table. She took her hand off the rock and turned back toward the house, walking through the desert evening that had become, in the space of less than 2 weeks, something she moved through with a familiarity she hadn't expected. Behind her, the creek ran on in the near dark, steady and clear, entirely indifferent to everything that had been done and was still being done in its name. The assessor from Holt's office arrived on Friday as promised, which was the first thing that had gone exactly according to plan since Eliza had stepped off the train in Red Valley, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that the relief she felt was disproportionate, a sign of how much tension she'd been carrying without fully acknowledging it. His name was Gerald Pruitt, and he was a methodical, unhurried man in his late 40s who wore the expression of someone who had learned not to form opinions until the numbers told him to. He spent 3 hours at the Caldwell property, working from the corner marker with instruments that were more precise than anything D. Garfield of Phoenix had apparently brought to his own assessment, and he did not say much while he worked beyond occasional requests for Eliza to hold one end of a measuring line or confirm a position. When he finished at the Caldwell Ranch, he rode to Clara Reyes's property and spent another 2 hours there while Ethan and Eliza waited in Clara's kitchen and drank her coffee and said very little to each other because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be premature. Clara sat with them and refilled the cups without being asked, and at some point she said, "Whatever happens with this, you two have done more in 2 weeks than most people manage in a year of trouble." "Most people don't come in with nothing to lose," Eliza said. "That's not why," Clara said, and looked at Ethan when she said it, and Ethan found something interesting to study on the surface of his coffee cup. Pruitt came back in the late afternoon and sat down at Clara's table with his notes spread in front of him. He had the careful demeanor of a professional who understood that what he was about to say had weight and who did not take that lightly. "The boundary at the Caldwell southeast corner," he said, is 14.7 feet east of its correct position as established by the original 1871 filing and confirmed by the corner marker. He looked at his notes. The boundary at the Reyes east fence is 11 feet east of its correct position by the same standard. He set the notes down. These are not measurement errors. The original markers are clear and undisturbed. The fence lines have been moved. Clara exhaled slowly. Ethan said nothing. He had gone very still in the way she had come to understand meant he was holding something in. "Will you put that in a written report?" Eliza asked. "I'll have it prepared and filed with Mr. Holt's office by Monday," Pruitt said. "He'll determine next steps from there." After Pruitt rode out, the three of them sat in Clara's kitchen, with the late light coming through the window, and for a little while no one spoke, because sometimes the right response to something you've been working toward for a long time is not words, but simply the acknowledgement that it has happened. Then Ethan said, "What does Holt do with the report?" "He has grounds now for a formal investigation," Eliza said. 2 properties with documented boundary fraud, a pattern of legal threats from the same attorney, a private surveyor with a prior contested assessment. And if he reaches Aldous Webb, she stopped. It becomes a record of systematic fraud, not a dispute between neighbors. "How long does an investigation take?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. "Could be weeks, could be months." Ethan looked at the table. "And in the meantime, we document everything and we don't give them anything new to work with," Eliza said. "No confrontations, no incidents that can be twisted around. We stay on the right side of every line and we let the investigation do what it's going to do." It was harder advice to follow than it sounded. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. Hale's men didn't come onto Caldwell property again, whether because they sensed something had shifted or because Hale's lawyer had counseled caution after some signal from Tucson, she didn't know. But the pressure didn't stop. It just changed shape. There were men she didn't recognize parked on the road outside the ranch gate twice in 1 week, doing nothing, just present. There was a conversation Ethan overheard in town between 2 of Hale's county commission allies about how Caldwell's operation was clearly failing and whether it was time for the county to assess back taxes on the property. Mabel at the diner told Eliza privately that someone had been asking around town about her, where she was from, why she'd come, whether she had any legal standing to be operating on Caldwell's ranch. She wrote all of it down. Every date, every detail, every overheard word that Ethan or Pharaoh or Clara could confirm. The ranch itself, meanwhile, was a different kind of ongoing project. The 43 head, back to 43, because Jim Pharaoh had quietly sold Ethan 2 replacement cattle at cost and wouldn't hear any argument about it, were in better condition than they'd been when she arrived. The garden she'd started from the seeds she found in a tin in the pantry was producing enough that they weren't spending money they didn't have on vegetables in town. The roan gelding's bruised hoof had healed cleanly. She had fixed the chicken coop door and acquired 6 hens from Clara in exchange for 3 days of fence work on Clara's east pasture, which meant they had eggs most mornings, which was a small thing that nonetheless made the days feel different. Ethan's arm had healed. That was its own kind of change. In the first week, she'd gotten used to him favoring it, working around it, the slight modification in every physical task that the injury required. When it stopped being necessary, he moved differently. More fully, more like someone occupying their whole body rather than protecting part of it. And she noticed this in a way she didn't examine too closely. They had developed a rhythm, the 2 of them, in the way that people who work the same land develop rhythms. Not by discussion, but by accumulation. Each person learning which tasks the other did better or faster, or with more patience and distributing accordingly. She handled the bookkeeping and the correspondence, and the legal documents and the garden, and the chickens and the medical care for the animals. He handled the cattle and the heavy fence work and the riding and the things that required the specific knowledge of a man who had known this land for 30 years. The overlap was large because most of ranch work is overlap, and neither of them commented on the arrangement because commenting would have required naming it, and neither of them was ready to name it yet. 4 weeks after Pruitt's visit, a letter arrived from Thomas Holt's office. They had reached Aldous Webb in New Mexico. Webb had agreed to speak with an investigator. Holt's office was formally opening a fraud inquiry into Victor Hale and Silas Crane under territorial land statutes. All relevant properties were to be considered under protective notice during the inquiry, meaning Hale could not advance any legal claims against Caldwell, Reyes, or Farrow's land while the investigation was active. Eliza read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Ethan stood across from her and watched her face. "Protective notice," she said. "The legal pressure stops while they investigate." He sat down slowly. "And the investigation is real," she said. "Webb talking is what made it real. He's a witness to the same pattern, different property, different time. That's not two neighbors disputing a fence line anymore." She set the letter down. "Holt is doing his job." Ethan looked at the letter. He put his hand flat on the table next to it, not touching it, just near it. She understood that gesture. The need to make something real through proximity when you're not sure yet whether to trust it. "You found Webb," he said. "I found the registry entry," she said. "Holt's office found Webb." "Because you told them to look." She didn't argue with that. What happened over the following 2 months was not dramatic in the way that stories make these things dramatic. It was bureaucratic and slow and involved a great deal of correspondence and 2 more visits from Pruitt and a trip to Tucson that Ethan made alone to give a formal statement, and none of it felt like victory while it was happening, because the machinery of investigation moves in ways that are invisible from the outside, and you can't tell while you're in it whether the thing is moving or stalled. Silas Crane's law license was suspended pending investigation in the 6th week. Eliza found this out not from Holt's office, but from Mabel at the diner, who had it from the mail carrier, who had it from the freight office in Tucson, which was how Red Valley processed most of its significant news. She sat with that information for a morning before she told Ethan, turning it over, checking it for the ways it could be less significant than it sounded. She couldn't find any. Crane losing his license meant the Territorial Bar Association was involved. That was not a thing that happened to men who were merely adjacent to fraud. Victor Hale fired Tom Draper the same week. She didn't know what that meant exactly, but she wrote it down because she wrote everything down, and it felt relevant, what she was not prepared for. And she thought, looking back, that she should have been, but some things you can't prepare for even when you know they're coming, was the morning Cord Bledsoe rode to the Caldwell gate alone, without his usual complement of riders, and asked to speak with Ethan. She was in the garden when she heard the hooves on the road, and she came around the side of the house and saw him sitting his horse at the gate with his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which was a different posture entirely from every previous time she'd seen him. He looked like a man who had spent several days making a decision and had just finished making it. She went inside and got Ethan. They stood in the yard together, and Bledsoe stayed on his horse, which she thought was probably deliberate, keeping himself at an exit, and he looked at Ethan and not at her when he spoke, which was also probably deliberate, but didn't change what he was saying. "I was there the night your cattle went," he said. "I didn't move them myself. I was there, watching the road." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I'm telling you because Hale told me yesterday that if the investigation comes to anything, he'll put the fence work on me and on Draper and say he didn't know what we were doing." He looked at the gatepost. "He'll make it our problem." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "And you're telling me this because I'm not going to take it for him," Bledsoe said flatly. "I did a lot of things for that man. This is where I stop." Eliza looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with an expression that asked a question, and she answered it with a slight nod. "Come inside," Ethan said to Bledsoe. She took Cord Bledsoe's statement at the kitchen table with Ethan present as witness, writing it longhand in the careful documentation style she'd developed over the past 3 months. Bledsoe was not a good man. She didn't think he was a good man, but he was a specific and useful thing in this moment, which was a witness with direct knowledge who had decided that his own self-interest and his anger at being made a scapegoat were more compelling than his loyalty to a man who had already decided to sacrifice him. She took the statement without judgment and without warmth and with complete accuracy. And at the end, she read it back to him, and he confirmed it, and she signed it below his name, and Ethan signed it as witness. After Bledsoe left, she sat at the table for a while, and Ethan sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for some time. "He could recant," Ethan said. "He could," she said, "or Hale could get to him before he talks to Holt." Also possible, she said, but the statement exists now. Even if he recants, we have it. And Holt's investigators are going to find physical evidence of the fence tampering that doesn't require Bledsoe to hold up. She paused. He just made it faster and cleaner. You're not satisfied, Ethan said, watching her. She looked at him. I don't trust it when things arrive easily at the end, she said. I keep waiting for the part we missed. What part do you think you missed? She thought about it for a long moment. Nothing, she said finally. I think we covered it. Then let yourself have that, he said. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at her with that directness she'd been managing around for weeks. The look that didn't calculate anything, that wasn't assessing or cautious or guarded. Just present, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has stopped pretending not to mean what they mean. Eliza, he said. Don't, she said. I haven't said anything yet. I know what you're going to say. Then I'll say it anyway, he said, because I've been not saying it for 3 months, and I'm tired of that. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she recognized as his way of making sure he stayed in the conversation instead of retreating from it. You came here with nothing. You fixed a fence and read some letters and found a survey map in a tobacco tin and figured out what I couldn't figure out in 2 years of being ground down. And somewhere in all of that, he stopped, started again. I'd like you to stay. Not because the ranch needs you. The ranch does need you, but that's not why I'm asking. She looked at the table, then at the window, then at him. I don't have a good history with staying somewhere I was invited, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. You weren't invited, he said. You showed up at my door because you had nowhere else to go, and then you decided to stay because of who you are, not because of anything I offered you. He paused. I'm not Caleb Mercer. I'm aware of what you did and why it mattered. I've been aware of it since the second day. She had nothing to say to that for a long moment. Through the kitchen window, she could see the south pasture where the cattle were grazing in the afternoon heat, and the line of the repaired fence. And beyond it, the slight glint that meant the creek was catching light the way it always did in the late afternoon. The ranch is still in trouble, she said. Less than it was. Holt's investigation could take months more. Yes, he said. You're still... She stopped, looked at him, at the lines on his face that were grief and weather in equal measure, at the hands that had been managing this land for 30 years and had very nearly lost it, at the eyes that were clear and direct and waiting. You're still in the middle of something hard, she said. I don't want you to mistake being helped through a hard time for something it isn't. I'm not, he said. I've had time to make sure of that. He said it without drama, just a plain statement from a man who had been sitting with an honest question and had arrived at an honest answer. This isn't gratitude. Gratitude doesn't feel like this. She looked at him for a long time. Ask me again when it's settled, she said. When the investigation is finished and the land is clear and things are ordinary, ask me then. He nodded once. He didn't push. She had understood from the beginning that he wasn't a man who pushed, which had made him occasionally frustrating to work with, and which now felt like the exact right quality in a person. The investigation concluded in the 9th week. Victor Hale was formally charged under territorial fraud statutes with conspiracy to falsify land boundaries, coordinated property interference, and abuse of legal process through Silas Crane. D. Garfield's surveying certification was revoked pending criminal referral. Aldous Webb's testimony, combined with Bledsoe's statement and the physical evidence from 3 properties and the original Caldwell survey documentation, had built a case. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office described in its filing as unusually well documented for a fraud of this nature. She read that phrase 3 times. Unusually well documented. She thought about the blister on her heel the first day she walked the property line, about the burned coffee on the second morning, about writing the date at the top of the first page of notes in the dark of the back room with the candle burning down and not knowing yet whether any of it would matter. Hale's land holdings were frozen, pending resolution of the charges, which meant the water rights question, the creek, the real point of all of it, was not yet permanently settled. But the freeze meant he couldn't move forward, couldn't pressure anyone, Couldn't use his commission connections because both men had quietly distanced themselves the moment the investigation became public. The machinery he had built over years to push people off their land had stopped. The letter from Holt's office arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Eliza was the one who rode to the gate to collect the mail because it had become her habit, and she sat on her horse in the morning sun and read it twice and then folded it back into the envelope and rode to the south pasture where Ethan was checking the fence line. He checked every week now out of what she suspected was equal parts habit and the need to see with his own eyes that it was still intact. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. She watched his face the way you watch a landscape when weather is moving through it, all the small changes of expression that a person makes when they are processing something that they have been waiting for without knowing whether the waiting would ever end. He looked up. "It's done," he said. "The charges are filed," she said. "It's not over entirely. There will be a proceeding. But Hale is not coming after this land while that's ongoing, and the evidence is strong enough that his lawyers are going to have a very difficult time." He looked back at the letter. Then he looked at the fence line and the pasture beyond it and the cattle moving in the morning quiet. He looked at all of it with the specific attention of a man who has seen something he was afraid he was about to lose and has just been told, conditionally, that he might not. "My father's marker rock," he said, "is exactly where it's always been," she said. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't say anything else for a minute, and she didn't fill the silence because it wasn't her silence to fill. "I have something to tell you," he said finally. She waited. "Caleb Mercer came to the ranch last week," he said, "when you were at Clara's checking the east fence." She went very still. "He heard what's been happening," Ethan said. "Apparently it's been the main topic of conversation in Red Valley for the last month." He looked at the fence post near him. "He wanted to know if you were here. I told him yes. He asked if he could come back and speak with you." He paused. "I told him that was your decision, and I'd pass along that he'd come by." She looked at the horizon. "What did he look like?" she said. She wasn't sure why she asked. "Like a man who had heard a story about himself that he didn't enjoy," Ethan said. She thought about the train platform, the 10 seconds, the envelope with $25, the way the crowd had gone quiet. "I don't need to speak with him," she said. "You're sure?" "Yes." She said it without heat, without the performance of certainty that would have suggested she was convincing herself. She was simply sure. Caleb Mercer had looked at her once and decided she wasn't worth knowing. Everything that had happened since, the fence posts and the legal letters and the tobacco tin and the 4 cattle in the night and the Tucson stage and Aldous Webb in New Mexico and Thomas Holt and Gerald Pruitt and Cord Bledsoe at the gate with his hat in his hands. None of it had happened because Caleb Mercer changed his mind. It had happened because she had walked 3 miles down a rutted road and knocked on a door and refused to leave when the man inside told her to go. There was nothing Caleb could offer her now that she needed. "Tell him I said thank you," she said. Ethan looked at her. "For leaving me on that platform," she said. "If he'd taken my hand at the station, none of this would have happened. I'd be somewhere on 400 acres in Arizona trying to figure out how to be what someone else decided he needed." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's a practical one," she said. A week later, Jim Farrow rode over with a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for what he called an occasion that actually warranted it, and Clara came with a pie that was better than it had any right to be given her stated indifference to baking, and the 4 of them sat on the porch of the Caldwell Ranch in the evening. Warmth, and Farrow poured, and they drank, and nobody made a speech because none of them were people who made speeches. But there was a quality to the sitting together that meant something, the particular texture of people who have been through something difficult and have come out the other side still standing and still on speaking terms. Clara looked at Eliza at some point and said, "What are you going to do now, after everything settles?" Eliza looked at the valley laid out below the porch in the evening light, the south pasture and the fence line and the distant glint of the creek and the hills beyond going dark blue in the dusk. "I don't know yet," she said, and then, because it was true, "I'm not leaving." Clara nodded. Farrow poured another measure. Ethan said nothing, but she felt him go still beside her in a way that she'd learned meant the opposite of absence. It meant he was more present, not less, pulling his attention into the moment rather than away from it. Later, after Pharaoh and Clara had ridden home, and the porch was quiet, and the night sounds of the desert had settled in around them, she and Ethan sat with the last of the whiskey between them and the sky overhead, doing what the sky over Red Valley always did, which was fill itself with more stars than seemed necessary. "You said to ask you again when it was settled," he said. "I know what I said." "It's not entirely settled," he said. "The proceeding is still coming. The water rights question is still open." "I know." "So technically—" "Ethan," she said. He was quiet. "You don't have to ask me again," she said. He turned to look at her. "I'm already here," she said. "I've been here. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him in the way she'd been not quite looking at him for 3 months, directly, without the deflection she'd been using to keep herself at a manageable distance from something she'd decided it was too complicated to want. "But I need you to understand what you're getting. I am not a woman who came here to be kept. I'm not going to become smaller so you can feel larger. I'm going to keep doing what I do, which is fix things that are broken and fight things that are wrong, and I am not always easy to live alongside." "I know that," he said. "You know it in theory," she said. "You've seen it for 3 months while we've had a shared enemy to organize around. That's different from ordinary life." "Maybe," he said, "but I also know that you spent 2 weeks on hard floors and blister-walking property lines and Tucson stagecoaches, and you never once, not once, made me feel like it was a burden I owed you something for. You just did the work because it needed doing." He looked at her steadily. "I've known a lot of people in 53 years. I have never known anyone who worked the way you work." She looked at the stars for a moment. "You're not a project," she said. "I need you to know that. You're not something I stayed to fix." "I know," he said. "The ranch was the project. I was in the way of it." She laughed. It came out before she could measure it, a real one, startled out of her by the dryness of it, and she heard him laugh too, low and rusty in the way of a man who hadn't laughed in long enough that the machinery needed a moment to engage. And for a little while they just sat there in the particular ease of two people who have stopped pretending to each other about anything. She reached over and picked up his hand. He looked down at their hands, and then at her, and said nothing, which was the right thing. They sat like that while the stars did their work overhead, and the desert settled into its deep night quiet, and somewhere in the southeast corner of the property, the creek ran on in the dark, steady and clear, the thing everything had been about, and the thing that would still be there long after all the documents and proceedings and letters and statements had been filed and concluded and forgotten. Here's what Eliza Hartwell understood, sitting on that porch, that she had not understood when she arrived in Red Valley with $41 and a worn letter and the remnants of someone else's idea of what her life should look like. Being rejected is not a verdict. It feels like one. In the moment, when you're standing on a train platform with a crowd around you and someone is walking away and you are holding a suitcase that contains everything you own. It feels final, definitive, like a door slamming in a way that means forever. But most of the time, a door that closes is just a door that closes. What's on the other side of it isn't determined by the closing. It's determined by what you do next. Whether you stand in front of it waiting for it to open again, or whether you pick up your suitcase and walk down a rutted road to a stranger's house and knock on the door and refuse to leave when he tells you to go. She had come to Red Valley to build a life with a man who looked at her and decided she wasn't worth knowing. Instead, she had walked into a fight for water rights and fraud documentation and survey maps, and she had met 3 people who had become, in the space of 12 weeks, the realest community she had known since her father was alive. The worth had never been in question. It had never depended on Caleb Mercer's recognition, or on the town's approval, or on Victor Hale's defeat, or even on Ethan Caldwell's hand in hers on a porch in the dark. The worth was there when she was breaking ice off a water trough in Ohio at 19. It was there when she signed the papers on her father's farm with her stomach in her throat. It was there when she walked off the platform in Red Valley and thought, well, this is where you are. Start from here. Some things you don't find out you know until the situation requires you to use them. She had known, for a long time, how to start from where she was. It turned out that was enough. Victor Hale's formal proceeding concluded 4 months later. He was found to have committed fraud against 3 landowners. Garfield was convicted on related charges. Silas Crane, without his law license, negotiated a settlement that included testimony against Hale in exchange for reduced charges. The water rights to the creek were formally confirmed as belonging to the Caldwell property, with established access rights for neighboring landowners codified in territorial record, which was, in its quiet legal way, the thing that made the victory not just Ethan's but the Valley's. Jim Farrow said at the time that it was the best outcome he hadn't expected. Clara Reyes said that she had expected it, which wasn't quite true, but was the kind of thing worth saying. Ethan said nothing about the preceding outcome for almost a full day after the news came. And then he went out to the southeast corner of the property and came back an hour later and told Eliza he'd put a proper post next to his father's marker rock, a new one, solid, to mark the boundary correctly. "We should record the new marker in the county register," she said. "I know," he said. "I was thinking you could come with me to do it." She looked at him. "I'm going to come with you to do most things," she said. "Going forward, you understand that?" "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm counting on." They filed the boundary record on a Thursday in late October at the county office in Red Valley, and the clerk who processed it was the same man who had been at the hotel desk the afternoon Eliza arrived and had told her about the diner and the laundry in a tone of mild apology. He recognized her. She could see it in the way he looked between her and Ethan and the document she'd prepared for filing. He stamped the record without comment, which was the appropriate response, and she took her copy and Ethan took his, and they walked out of the county office into the October morning in Red Valley, where the heat had finally backed off into something bearable and the main street was going about its ordinary business. Mabel Couch waved from the diner window as they passed. Eliza waved back. She had $41 when she stepped off the train in this town. She had a suitcase and a worn letter and the public humiliation of a man she'd never met deciding she wasn't worth keeping. She had walked 3 miles down a bad road and slept on a floor and fixed fences and read legal documents and ridden stages and knocked on doors until the right ones opened. She had not done it gracefully. She had done it with a blister on her heel and burned coffee and insufficient sleep and at least 2 moments in the back room of the Caldwell Ranch when she had lay in the dark and thought that she had made yet another catastrophic miscalculation with what remained of her life. It turned out those moments were survivable. It turned out most moments were. Ethan held the door of the general store open for her because he was a man of his generation, and he did things like that. And she went through it and bought flour and salt and a new pen because hers had finally given out, and he stood beside her at the counter with the patient ease of a man who has stopped being in a hurry. And the morning went on around them, ordinary and unhurried, and fully, solidly real. Outside, the street of Red Valley went about its business. The creek on the southeast corner of the Caldwell property ran on. The marker rock sat where it had always sat, exactly where an honest man had placed it 50 years before, waiting for someone to measure from it correctly. Someone finally had.